What do you call it when a US president doesn't blink, but instead slaps a 50% tariff on Europe? When Europe doesn't flinch, but strikes back by incinerating a $43 billion Boeing deal, rerouting trade through Canada, and triggering a $2 trillion shift in global commerce? You don't call it a dispute, you call it the beginning of a controlled collapse. This wasn't a negotiation gone bad. This was a rupture. A quiet, calculated unraveling of the post-war economic order. One tariff, one retaliatory strike at a time. And while Washington pounded the table, ranting about steel and sovereignty, Brussels was already in motion, cold, strategic, and ahead of the curve. This isn't a warning. This is the moment the lights go out. May 30th, President Trump walks to the podium. He declares talks with Europe dead. Effective June 1st, a 50% blanket tariff on all European imports. Cars, steel, aluminum, food, electronics, everything. The order hits like a shockwave. Within 48 hours, European markets slump. Investors panic, and Boeing, the crown jewel of U.S. exports, is staring down the barrel of catastrophe. In Brussels, there is no outrage, just precision. The European Commission quietly locks the crosshairs onto 95 billion in U.S. goods. Then the unthinkable, a 43 billion euro Boeing deal frozen. Ryanair's 30 billion order of 737 MAX jets under review. Their CEO warns Boeing's costs have spiraled out of control. And just like that, a door cracks open, one that leads to China. Comarmac, China's state-backed jet manufacturer, enters the frame. For years, Europe wouldn't dare consider Chinese aircraft. Now Brussels is modeling it into forecasts. Airbus surges, and Boeing, it bleeds. The U.S. aerospace sector, already battered by supply chain chaos, now faces not a downturn but a tectonic shift. But this wasn't a counterpunch, it was a dress rehearsal, a test run for a world that doesn't need Boeing, a world that doesn't need America. And then came the hits to the gut. Harley-Davidson, Levi's, peanut butter, symbols of Americana, now weapons in a trade war. These weren't just tariffs, they were statements. Calculated strikes against swing state industries. Harley's EU exports plummet 30%. Projected losses $145 million by Q3 2025. And still, the worst was yet to come. U.S. agriculture buckled. Farm exports to Europe plunged by $23.2 billion. Wisconsin-based Land O'Lakes said the tariff spike on dairy hit immediately. Butter, cheese, gone from shelves. And yet, the administration claimed the tariffs were working, that they'd protect the American worker. But the numbers told a darker truth. The U.S. trade deficit soared to a record $140.5 billion in early 2025. Not stronger, not safer, just more exposed, fragile. And while the White House played chicken with the global economy, Europe did something far more dangerous. It pivoted. Diplomatic bridges burned in Washington were quietly rebuilt elsewhere. Canada stepped in. Under CDA, the EU and Canada eliminated 98% of tariffs. Trade between them is now projected to top 90 billion euros annually by 2026. A frictionless corridor, a new transatlantic, but without the Atlantic. European giants like Siemens and Alum are already moving procurement pipelines to Quebec and Ontario. U.S. tariffs have made steel and autos too expensive. America priced itself out. Europe walked away. And the most terrifying part? It worked. This wasn't just a fight. This was a fork in history, and the U.S. once the axis of global trade is no longer at the center. The global architecture is being rewritten, not in Washington, in Brussels, in Ottawa, in Beijing. The Boeing deal didn't die in a vacuum. It was a signal, a bell tolling at the end of an era. And by the time America realizes what's gone, the room may already be sealed, the table reset, the future negotiated without the U.S. even invited. In May 2025, the Financial Times reported a stunning figure. Canadian EU clean tech trade had soared 41% in just 1 year. At the heart of it, a $1.2 billion hydrogen deal signed not in a boardroom, but at last year's EU-Canada Clean Technology Summit. While Washington turned inward, shutting out climate-related funding, Canada opened its markets, aligning seamlessly with EU standards on labor, digital governance, and the environment. And that's when something shifted. What started as a free trade agreement morphed into something deeper. Former Canadian Trade Minister Chrystia Freeland called it a strategic partnership. But behind the diplomacy, one message rang louder than any press release. Europe no longer sees Canada as America's neighbor. It sees Canada as America's replacement. Because this isn't just about tariffs, this is about a collapsing order. In the span of 10 weeks, U.S. tariffs escalated from 10% on aluminum to 50% across the board. Retaliations followed, WTO complaints flooded in, Transatlantic mega deals worth tens of billions now dangled by a thread. The EU paused a $21 billion counterstrike, but only until July 15th. A second list is already in the works, targeting $95 billion in U.S. exports. Washington insists Trump's online tirades aren't official policy. Brussels isn't buying it. On June 2nd, the European Commission announced countermeasures will take effect July 14th or earlier. Translation: even if diplomacy is still technically alive, time isn't. The window is slamming shut, and what's at stake is no longer just trade. It's trust, dependence, influence, identity. While Washington picked a fight, Europe rewrote the rules. Billions flowed into clean energy infrastructure. The goal: sever reliance on U.S. supply chains. According to Financial Times, EU-Canada energy projects exploded in 2024, with $1.2 billion funneled into hydrogen and battery tech. Behind the scenes, the Brussels-Vancouver summit standardized solar components, secured rare earth supply chains, and greenlit AI-powered electric grids. Under its Repower EU plan, the bloc committed to producing 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen per year by 2030, enough to wipe out $60 billion in fossil fuel imports. This isn't just diversification, it's insulation, intentional, strategic, irreversible. Clean power is flowing, new routes, new partners, new protocols. And as the global industrial center of gravity shifts, it's no longer pulled by Washington or Beijing. Europe is charting its own arc, funded by itself, pointed due north. But this isn't just about clean tech, it's spreading. If Ryanair pulls the plug on its $30 billion Boeing order, it would mark a once unthinkable first. A major EU airline choosing China's Comarmac jets over American aircraft. Bloomberg says the talks have already started. Tariff-driven price hikes, supply chain delays, it's all collapsing on Boeing. CEO Michael Oley made the stakes explicit. If costs don't stabilize, all options are on the table. And if Ryanair flips, it doesn't just hurt Boeing's balance sheet. It legitimizes China's foothold in a Western-dominated market. It fragments FAA influence. It splits the global standard for aviation safety. Airbus might get a short-term bump, but the long-term signal is seismic. The skies are no longer American. CETA wasn't a trade pact. It was a trial run. Now the model is spreading across Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Since 2023, EU negotiators have opened 17 new bilateral talks. The template: zero tariffs, labor alignment, digital infrastructure bundled into trade deals, AI, semiconductors, fiber networks offered as joint investments in Kenya, India, the UAE. While the U.S. focused on tariffs, the EU signed a $3.4 billion supply chain deal with India, bypassing the dollar entirely in key energy contracts. Wall Street Journal analysts aren't calling this retaliation anymore. They're calling it a strategy, a pivot, structural re. The U.S. built a wall, Europe built an exit, and the world is moving through it. When Trump imposed 50% tariffs and slammed the door on an EU deal, Brussels didn't negotiate. It pivoted. Today, it's preparing to strike back at $95 billion in U.S. exports. And Bloomberg Economics warns if this continues, U.S.-EU trade could shrink by $2 trillion over the next decade. This isn't turbulence, it's tectonic. Airbus shares surged in Frankfurt. Canadian steel exports to Europe jumped 24% in Q1 2025. 7 new trade deals, excluding the U.S., are now moving at full speed. At a recent Brussels panel, former EU Commissioner Cecilia Malmström put it bluntly: decoupling isn't a threat, it's a plan. Washington thought tariffs would force Europe back to the table. But Europe didn't pause. It built alternate corridors. It backed alternate suppliers. It reduced transatlantic friction with surgical precision. The silence from Washington, it's no longer leverage, it's irrelevance. So here's the question. What happens when Boeing loses the skies? When calm gains credibility? When the U.S. is no longer at the table where hydrogen, semiconductors, and next-gen aviation are decided? This isn't a tantrum. It's an extraction. Contract by contract, tariff by tariff, pivot by pivot. Europe is unplugging methodically, deliberately, permanently. And as Washington keeps pulling the same rusty levers it's relied on for 3 decades, Brussels is writing a new script. One that doesn't need permission. One that doesn't wait. If this $2 trillion rupture is the wake-up call, the next chapter won't just shift the balance of trade, it will redefine who gets to shape the world.